Dave, I'm feeling a little sore today. This weekend, my wife and I were out in the yard doing things I don't normally do. I was throwing a pickaxe. I had to break up all this ground, and it's real hard, like packed clay.
Right.
And so I was out. I thought it would take 15 minutes. It took 3.5 hours. And now today I'm just sore. I'm getting old, but more importantly, I don't do that sort of thing all the time. It's a funny thing, you can work out and be physical, but if you go do something that your muscles aren't trained to do,
Sure.
Man, you walk away kind of sore. And as I was getting ready this morning, I took a couple extra Tylenol just to help me get out of bed. It got me thinking about a big part of what we do at the Vino Veritas Society, which is, just like there's this thing called muscle memory, right? When you train a muscle, athletes, right? They have to practice
Sure.
over and over and over. You can't just tell someone, here's how to hit a 100-mile-an-hour fastball, and then they know it, right? They got to practice it over and over and over. And it's the same way with our minds. It's the same way with thinking. It's the same way with speaking and writing. To do it well means you got to practice. So if you want to think well, you got to practice thinking. If you want to speak and write well, you got to practice. And that's a big part of what the Vino Veritas Society is. It's an opportunity to practice these things over and over.
It makes me think of all the people who are the non-political friends among us, right? The people I know who just say, you know what, I want to know enough to make a good decision when it comes to the elections. But I try to encourage them. One of our core virtues is civic knowledge, and I try to encourage them. I appreciate what you're saying, but you can't just vote on somebody because you think they're going to give you the better life or whatever else. You got to really understand, have that civic knowledge. And they say, yeah, but it gives me such a headache. But it's the same thing, right?
Yeah.
That headache is the same soreness you have.
That's right.
I don't think about those things often enough. And so all of a sudden, you're making me think about something, and it just gives me a headache, and I don't want to do it.
It's unpleasant. It's
Right.
uncomfortable, just like me out there yesterday trying to throw that pickaxe into the dirt. And so that's an important part, right? If we are to get better, and Lord knows we need to get better, those of us who care about freedom, who care about constitutional government, there are occasionally some politicians who come along who we like, and maybe they actually do some good things. And still the bottom line is, over the last 100 years, when you look at what's been happening in government, the whole trend is in one direction, and it's not good. The direction is more government, more power, more spending, more regulations, more bureaucrats, more of all those things, and we want to scale it back, which is why we need to create an entire cultural movement out there, kind of crowdsourcing of the message of freedom from thousands of fellow Americans, teach them some core basic ideas, and then encourage them to practice how to communicate with their fellow citizens.
So what you're saying is that headache is worth it, because you're going to start to learn how to do these things. It's going to be easier to think about, and you're not going to have those headaches if you do it enough.
It's like the kid who's just learning baseball. The first time he goes out and swings a little bit, he might be a little sore.
Right.
But if he keeps at it, it's going to become a very comfortable motion, and then all of a sudden he's a big leaguer hitting home runs.
Well,
and we want the big leaguers.
Right. We can all only hope. The other aspect, though, of what you did this week, and the other aspect of swinging that pickaxe for 3.5 hours, and we joke saying, you're sore, and we kind of joke that it gets easier over time, and it probably does. But swinging a pickaxe for 3.5, 4.5, 8 hours, 9 hours a day, every day, never really gets easy, right? And so when you think about it from those terms, it brings me back to the conversation we've had the last couple weeks. It brings us back to that idea of, how do you incentivize somebody, and what should the incentives be to the person who we need to be out swinging that pickaxe,
right,
knowing that they're going to go home tired and sore, and they are doing years of damage to their body over all of that time. And what does the future look like? It's the football players. The average football career is 3 years. And in those 3 years, they're doing enormous damage to their bodies.
I want to inject here a little story. So we know personally a former wide receiver in the NFL. He's still a young man. He's in his 30s right now. I think he played in the NFL maybe 8, 9 years, 10 years, something
Had to
like
be
that.
something around there.
And you and I had dinner with him
Right.
not too long ago. And I asked him specifically, I said, we were talking about all the research that's come out with concussions, right, and brain damage. I mean, this is serious health concerns. And I asked him, I said, do all the players know this going into it? And he sort of chuckled. He said, oh, yeah, everybody knows it. I'm like, are there concerns? He said, man, everybody wants the money. Every single one. They fully know the risks. They know the dangers. The coach would often say, if you don't want to get hurt, get out of here, because this is football. You're going to get hurt. And everyone, from their point of view, their value, right? They value the opportunity to make this enormous amount of money in a short period more than they valued the risk of doing some damage, to their head, to their brain.
And it's not just to their head and brain. I don't want to bring down the mood too much, but I actually had a friend I grew up with. I knew him my whole life. We went to preschool together. I mean, that's how far back we went. He was a lineman for CU. We went to college together. He played offensive line. Had so much back damage, so much damage to his back and knees.
Yeah.
Actually committed suicide after college because he couldn't handle the pain anymore. And he never made a penny in the NFL.
Right.
Guy was a 6'9", 320-pound lineman. He probably had the frame to do it.
Right.
Body couldn't make it through college and physically wasn't able to go play at that next level. So the point is, we have to understand, and there is this incentive, there is this idea of what is the value of the work you're providing versus the compensation you're getting. And most of these guys do it because they're providing a value, and that value is being incentivized.
And think of, when you think of a professional athlete in terms of an employee, especially a really dangerous sport like football, where there is a high probability of sustaining some kind of terrible injury. And you ask that question, right? Why are they willing to accept so much risk? And they say, well, because they can make potentially millions of dollars playing football, and maybe they don't have another opportunity to make that much make that much money. Now compare that. Those people, those players, those employees, they are employees. They're working for it. They're hired by a team. Think of how much risk they accept in return for that opportunity to make a lot of money, versus employees out there who are just they're complaining that they're not getting paid enough. They don't like their job, but they're not willing to take on any more risk at all. And yet they want to get paid more. Well, you see the guys who really get paid a whole lot, they're willing to take an enormous risk. Ordinary employees at an ordinary business can take on more risk simply by going and looking for a new job, or maybe trying to learn some kind of new skill, some kind of new talent themselves.
That's the real key, right? Is getting better at the thing you're doing. Getting better, keep working at the thing you're doing, adding skills to it, adding new capabilities to it. You talk about the guy who hits the 100-mile-an-hour fastball and who can keep hitting that 100-mile-an-hour fastball. Look at the pitchers who are throwing them.
Yeah.
There are a lot more people out there who can throw a fastball in the 90s that don't make it to the major leagues than there are people who do. And the difference is because the guys who make it add other pitches. They learn how to throw curveballs. They learn how to throw sliders.
Speaking of, this is a non-serious point, but I got to make this weekend. I don't know if you saw this. Zach Greinke, he's a pitcher for the Houston Astros, and he's one of the elite. He's a very good pitcher. He threw a 54-mile-an-hour strike. I think they call it an ephus pitch, right? This guy can throw in the high 90s. He's one of the elite pitchers, and it's almost funny to see he throws this little blooper. It was like slow pitch softball. This thing was so slow, and that batter didn't know what to do with it. Stood and got a called strike on it.
It's the knuckleballers, right? The guy who knows how to throw the knuckleball.
Yeah, that's right. And that's all about adding value, right? Which sort of brings us to the this topic we've been talking about, and it's so important because it is so central to everything going on in our lives, in our government today. And it's the basic difference between a business and government. We've talked about this some, but we really haven't dug into what exactly are the incentives for a business. What makes a business go? Why do business owners and employees, why do they do what they do? What is it they're trying to get after?
Sure.
And how does that differ from people in government, from say a civil servant, tenured bureaucrat in some federal regulatory agency? what's his incentives versus the incentives of a business owner? And I think you have to start with looking at the business model. Many people will kind of sneer at the idea that the purpose of a business is to make a profit. I mean, that's sort of a distilled down. It's true. I mean,
Yeah.
If you're running a business and you're not making a profit, you got real problems on your hands. You're not going to be able to stay open much longer, maybe unless you get some government subsidy or contract or something like that. But if you're just operating in a free market, you've got your own bills to pay. You got to pay employees. You got to pay rent on your building. You got to keep the lights on. Running your business, you got to buy inventory and you got to market your services and products. It takes money to run a business. If you're not profitable, you've got a serious problem. But then when you start to really pull on that string, well, what does that mean to make a profit? It opens up this big, much wider view of a business. To make a profit means you're going to have to make some people happy. You have to offer something that they appreciate,
Yes.
that they want, that they value. Otherwise, you're not going to be profitable. And that incentive to try to make people happy, and to be sure, some businesses fail to make people happy, and they tend to go out of business pretty soon. But it's one of the reasons we ought to be more willing. I'm not saying we be naive about it, but be more willing to trust a business, because their basic incentive is to try to attract people and offer something of value to them.
Did you ever see this show? I don't even know what channel it's on, but there's a show called Bar Rescue.
Oh, absolutely, yes, yeah.
And one of the common themes you see in all these bars that end up on Bar Rescue, it's the same common theme. It's an owner who would rather go have fun at his or her bar than actually take care of their customers, actually be the manager. Understand that even though they're the owner, they're still going to work every day.
Right.
And it's this common theme of they're creating value for themselves.
Yes.
Rather than creating value for their customers. And what happens every time? The business fails. And they have to call John Taffer in and say, John, please come save my business. I don't understand why it's failing. And he looks at him and he says, because you're too busy having fun over there as opposed to making sure that your customer is sitting at the bar is having fun. And it's a simple idea.
And this might be one of the most important lessons that Americans can learn in our modern progressive era, which is also a very modern narcissistic era. I think human beings have a narcissistic trend in them always.
Sure.
But in an age where our smartphones, I remember when the smartphones very first started putting cameras on the front. I mean, what did that symbolize? People weren't happy with taking pictures of things away from them. They wanted to take pictures of themselves, and that's why they need a camera on the front of the screen. I mean, we have all this technology that feeds into our narcissism, and I think it's not a hard argument to make. We're more narcissistic as a culture today than ever before. Inward-looking, self-focused, and in this modern, progressive, narcissistic era, it is so important to remember that if you want to create wealth for yourself, pursue your self-interest, the most important thing you can do is to stop thinking about yourself and start thinking about other people. That's basically that Bar Rescue show you're talking about. That's his number one lesson he's trying to teach these owners. Think about your customers. Think about other people. What do they want? What do they value? And how can you produce and supply and distribute whatever it is other people want?
So why is it? And this is sort of the fundamental question of American politics today. Why is it that so many people out there sit there and say, I don't trust that business to give me what I want, so I want the government to give it to me?
In fact, I want to make this point even stronger before we talk about government. In my own studies of human history, human nature, I've been a lifelong student of political philosophy, which really is the study of human nature. There are two institutions, two human phenomena that tie together the interests of multiple people in a stronger way than anything I've ever seen. One is the natural family. And there's a biological reason for it, right? When a man and woman have a child, both of them see there's a resemblance. John Locke talks about this, that in a way a parent's care for the interests of their child is a form of self-interest, because they're kind of taking care of themselves in the sense that their child is an extension of themselves. Often the child actually looks like them, right? So taking care of one's child is a way of taking care of yourself. And you see this connection within many families when everyone in our audience who are parents will relate to this. When your children are happy, you as a parent, you're happy. When your children are hurt or have a problem, you're hurt. I mean, there's this direct connection in the family. The other institution that ties the interests of people together, unites them, connects them, is business. I've never seen anything else like that. A business says, for me, the business owner, to pursue my interest. My interest is I want to improve my life. I want to create more wealth. I want to have more options, be able to buy a better house. How do I do that? By serving the interests of others.
Right.
Figure out what they want, what they need. How can I help them? And the more value I provide to them, the better it is for me. In that way, it unites the interests of people together in a beautiful way.
Which is why you see business owners all the time, that moment when somebody comes to them and says, you did a really great job. You delivered something. We've been in various businesses in various roles, even as an employee. And this, I think it's important to note that this doesn't just apply to business owners. It's anybody involved in business at any level. When you're an employee and you get that letter from a customer that says, hey, I'm going out of my way to thank you because you did something, you went above and beyond, you really made this a great experience for me, and I appreciate what you did. There's very few better feelings in the world than that. It's that knowing that you just provided real value to somebody who was looking for value, and you did your job well enough to deliver that value that they were looking for.
Absolutely. And that's part of the process of trying to be profitable, right? Because I mean, it's a wonderful feeling. When that happens, the person who wrote the letter felt good writing the letter. That's why they're writing the letter, right? This person in this business just helped me out in a pinch. And the employee or the business owner who receives the letter, it's a wonderful feeling. That means that they're trusting each other. They're building trust. They're much more likely to engage in exchanges. It's one of the reasons why I really push back when I hear business owners talk about the importance of giving money away in some philanthropic way, giving money to a tax-exempt, 501c3 charity or something like that. Very often, successful business owners will say, well, I feel like I need to give back to the community. And when you really think about that statement, to give back, the premise there is that they took something.
Right.
Almost like they're thieves. They took something, and so they think they should give at least some of it back. But the fact is they didn't take anything. They produced. That's what they did as a business owner. They went back to that basic primordial choice, that binary option. Do I want to live or die?
Right.
And they said, I want to live, and I'm going to get up off my butt, and I'm going to go be productive. I'm going to use my mind, use my hands, produce something that other people value. In that process, you're providing value to someone else in exchange, right? In exchange for something. You're not taking from anybody. And so I want to remind business owners out there, if you run your business well and it is successful, it's profitable, not because of some crony arrangement, not because you made some side deal with some politician, right, who sent a big subsidy. No, I mean, you're just out there competing against other businesses, and you're providing a lot of value, and you're profitable. You have already done much, produced much, given much. You deserve to be complimented and praised just for what you've done already. You don't need to give back because you haven't taken anything.
And the best thing that business owner can do, or that employee can do, or whatever, but the best thing that person can do is to take that money that they feel like they need to go give back to the community, invest it in R&D. You have a company that is effectively producing value for other people. Right. That shows that you know how to do something that a lot of people in this country, a lot of people in this world don't know how to do effectively. Businesses close every day. And there's a lot of people who don't know how to effectively provide value to their customers.
Yep.
If you're making money enough that you can give some away, that means you do. So go figure out something else you can create that can provide value. That's that added value. That's that next product. That's next evolution. You look at companies like Apple. You look at companies like Microsoft. You look at some of these tech companies that are exploding.
Right.
That's what they do.
Yep.
That's why they're valued at $2 trillion.
You know, it's interesting. A couple of years ago, I had breakfast with an older, seasoned, highly successful businessman, and he's very well read. He's a voracious reader, and when we met for breakfast, he had been reading through the biographies of many of those great captains of industry, the turn of the last century, guys like Rockefeller and Vanderbilt, right, and J.P. Morgan, that whole group there in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And he started talking about them, and he started basically scolding them. And I said, I'm a little surprised because this guy I was having breakfast with, he's an entrepreneur, he's a free marketeer, he's a constitutionalist. I said, I thought those guys would kind of be your heroes. And he said, well, I loved their entrepreneurial creativity. He said, you know what I didn't like about them? The ones who gave away so much money. They were basically preparing Americans to become dependents.
Yeah.
They were, Carnegie went and built libraries all over the country and built hospitals and these things. And I had never thought about this. He said, think of the people in those communities. They were being trained that you can get a library, you can get a school, you can get a hospital for nothing. You don't have to pay for it. He was challenging that whole premise of philanthropy. And he made the argument to me. He said what you just said. He said they should have either reinvested that money into something like research, development, somehow expand, improve what they do, or invest it back into their own employees, all the way down to the guy scrubbing the bathroom. Because the guy scrubbing the bathroom and everyone else, they are part of a team that has to work together. That team is who created the value for so many others that translated into the profit. Let them enjoy the fruits of their own work, just being part of that team.
So it's interesting you just said that. When you really think about it, and I've never heard that argument before, but it's interesting. And when we hear these democratic socialists in our society right now, the AOCs, the Bernies, right? They're saying it's the employees who make the billionaires, right?
Right.
They're making essentially that argument. But what would they say if you said to them, okay, here's what we're going to do. That billionaire is going to stop making all charitable donations.
Right.
The Gates Foundation is gone, right? It donates billions of dollars a year. Jeff Bezos, never making a charitable donation again. He's not going to build any more hospitals. He's not going to build any more schools. He's not going to do any scholarships, nothing. He's done. No more charitable donations. But all that money is going to go to his employees. I wonder how they would respond to that.
I don't know. I wonder how those employees were. I mean, wouldn't that be a tremendous model, a tremendous experiment? Say, look, you're part of this team that helped create all this value, helped generate all this profit. You should share in that to a much bigger degree than you actually do. And because at the heart here of what we're saying, at the heart of a business is productivity. And in a way, that's the key to life. That's the key to human life. If we want a better life, a more comfortable life, if we want a reliable supply of nutritious food and medicines to cure us when we're sick and, sturdy shelters to live in, all those things that we value require productivity. Well, where do you find productivity? In businesses. That's what a business is all about. Contrary to, right, a business, let's be real clear here, a business generates profit and it earns income, it earns revenue by producing things that other people value, and then trading, right? It puts it out for sale, whether it puts it for sale in terms of cash or we'll trade you for something else.
Sure.
It's always an exchange. Now contrast that model of a business with a model of government.
Right.
You think about the three basic powers any government has: legislative, executive, and judicial. What those powers are. The legislative power is the power to make laws, to make rules, most of which are prohibitions. Most laws are some form of thou shalt not do something, right? You're prohibited from doing something. And then the executive power is the power to go enforce that, to make sure people are not doing what the law says they're not supposed to do. And then if there's ever a question whether someone actually violated the law or not, the judicial power is the power to sit and judge whether or not this person or this party committed violated the law. In that whole process of government, writing law, passing laws, enforcing laws, judging when they get broken, there's no value created. There's no new houses built, no new medicine is invented, no food is grown or cultivated, right? Government creates, we know as social scientists, we actually know precisely how much wealth government creates. And the answer is zero wealth. It can print money, but it can't actually create real wealth. It can't create the things we value, like houses and cars and medicines and clean water and things like that.
And just to remind people, for all the people listening, if that one little sentence didn't trigger anything for you, didn't make you think of it, go back and watch 2 podcasts ago. Because that was the whole conversation, was money versus wealth. A government can print money that doesn't. Wealth and money are 2 very different things.
Right. Wealth are things that we value. Wealth is things, having something that other people value means you're wealthy. If you have an idea in your head that other people value, if you have a skill, a talent, if you can hit 100-mile-an-hour fastball and other people value watching you hit 100-mile-an-hour fastball, you're a wealthy person. If you own real estate, if you own a home that other people value, that means that you are wealthy. You being wealthy means you have something other people value and want, which is very different than just printing money, right?
Right.
Printing money doesn't supply people with what they actually value.
And all things aren't valued equally, and they shouldn't be, right? You just talked about real estate. If I own real estate in one part of the country or in one area, where there's no services or where it's far away from a city or where it's something that fewer people desire, it doesn't have the same value as other real estate. That's why they always say the first rule of real estate is location, location, location.
Well, and also different individuals value things differently, right? You might value a certain kind of car, a certain kind of motorcycle, a certain kind of music, right? These things might be of value to you that to me, I don't care about. You might be willing to buy a ticket, an expensive ticket to a certain concert because you really value that band, that music. Right. I say, I don't really care for them. It's not worth it to me to buy that ticket. And that's part of what makes the world of business so beautiful. You have different people being productive in the form of businesses, producing different things, and I can look at those different businesses and I get to choose which ones do I value. I'm going to buy the things that I value, and I'm not going to buy the things that I don't value. And you get to, and everybody else gets to choose freely what trades to engage in, what businesses to support based on whether they're producing things that individuals want. Contrast that with the realm of government. Right. Government says we're going to implement this new policy. We're going to create the new, the name of the regulatory agency created by the Frank
Dodd-Frank, the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
There you go. We're going to create this thing, and we're going to staff it with a bunch of very expensive, highly paid bureaucrats, and we're going to come and take money from you to do this. And what happens if you say, but I don't value that? I don't want that. In fact, I think that thing's going to cause more harm than good. So I don't want to support that. Government says, doesn't matter. We're going to come and take your money from you. They will eventually threaten force. This is the other big difference between a business and government. All a business can do is offer something to you and say, here's what we have to trade, and hope that you agree, but they have no way to command you, to make you, to compel you. But government will say, we're going to come take your money. And if you don't send it to us, eventually government agents with guns will show up at your door and they'll put you in jail, and then they'll still take your money to fund this thing you want nothing to do with.
And that's the individual side of it. That's the consumer side of it, right? The CFPB, it's the Consumer Protection Bureau, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They're there to protect citizens. So as citizens, you have to give all this money. But what about the business side of it? The mortgage companies, the real estate companies, the title companies, the banks that were all having to report to the CFPB, the extra cost in things that don't create value for their customer, right? The extra lawyers, the extra accountants, the extra bookkeepers and processors and everything else that goes into that makes their cost to provide their initial thing of value to the consumer so much more expensive that now as the customer, you have to make a determination. One, I have to give the government my money to fund the CFPB.
Right.
And two, now that value proposition from that business has changed for me. What might have cost me $5 before now costs me $500. Is that service that company is providing, it was worth $5 to me. In fact, I valued it higher than $5, and therefore wealth was being created. Do I value it at $500? If not, I might not purchase.
So
anymore.
Let's make clear the principle at the core of what you were just saying. Regulations make things more expensive. Always. Regulations never make things less expensive. They always add to the costs. They add in all kinds of ways. They add to the operating costs. They add to the overhead of the businesses. They add to the compliance costs, hiring the lawyers and the bureaucrats just to fill out all the forms. In that sense, regulations they're not merely bad for everyone. They're especially bad for people who have little money because if you have little money, if you're poor, the more regulations we have, the more expensive things become. It's also bad for the businesses. I've got a copy here. Someone wrote a great book on this subject, Save the Swamp, and that's a book by me. I'm just being facetious. But it is a good book. You should go get a copy. And, I talk in there about the consumer.
Let's be clear first, before you talk about what you're talking about. Let's be clear. When people hear Save the Swamp, it's a satire. This book is satire. We're not actually advocating to save the swamp.
Yeah, the book is Save the Swamp, and the subtitle is A Career Guidebook for Budding Bureaucrats. And in it, I give advice about how bureaucrats can use their power as an unelected bureaucrat to harass people, to shut down businesses, to seek revenge on an ex-spouse, all kinds. And it's written in the spirit of Jonathan Swift's famous book about eating children, which was a satire, a modest proposal. C.S. Lewis's famous satire, The Screw Tape Letters. That one is about the devil, an agent of the devil, a bureaucrat who's a top bureaucrat working for Satan, giving advice to his nephew who's out there in the world trying to corrupt human beings. And so it is a satire like that. And I have a section I talk about the Consumer Financial
Protection Bureau.
Yeah, that's it. There's so many. It's easy to get these things mixed up. Since that was passed, the Dodd-Frank bill in 2010, I believe.
Which is now gone, by the way.
It was about a decade ago. Within 5 years, thousands of small banks, community savings and loans, those types of institutions, which in many small towns, that might be the only one around. Thousands shut down. And in that same period of time, no new ones were created. Because to start, say, a small savings and loan in a small town, all of a sudden the opening compliance costs, the costs you had to pay for all the lawyers, all the bureaucrats, went into the hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars before the doors were even open, before you even opened for business. And most people in small communities who's sitting there with millions of dollars to pay a bunch of bureaucrats and lawyers before you can even open the business. So they said, to heck with it. I'll invest my capital in something else, not in some crazy scheme like that.
Right.
And let me add this.
Okay.
So as all these thousands of small banks are closing, guess who loved that? Guess who benefited by that? The big banks.
Because they were too big to fail.
That's right. The big And you think of the sad irony. Progressivism says we need these regulations to protect you, the consumer, the citizen, not merely from corporations and businesses, but especially from the big corporations. They're the ones with all the power, we're going to protect you from them. You know what those regulations do? They end up benefiting the great big businesses and corporations, and they crush little businesses.
And you just hit on one of my biggest issues with government as a whole. When we talk about the progressives in government and they create these regulations, they always want to reference the big companies. They reference Walmart. They reference Procter & Gamble. They reference all these huge companies, and they make laws based on what those companies are able to do. And you talk about regulations like the CFPB, but there are other things that qualify as regulations that people don't always think about as a regulation, like a minimum wage, like forced union work. When we look at the minimum wage conversation, you hear all the progressives in Congress saying, oh, Walmart can afford a $15 or an $18 minimum wage. They don't care about the coffee shop down the street. They don't care about the small plant shop or the small business, any small business, who if you force a $15 or $18 minimum wage on them, they're gone. They're out of business. They don't exist. And all those people lose their jobs. It's the same thing with forcing people to use union labor. We've talked about this story. There's a story.
Let me add to that before we move on. So, because you just said a couple of really important things. You're absolutely right about how the regulations actually are in the interest of the big corporations. It's why when you go to Washington, D.C., right down the street from the Capitol of the United States Congress, what you find are these lobbying offices. And guess who has offices there? All the big corporations.
Right.
What do they do there? And the answer is, well, they hire people to be in those offices, to walk over to Congress and meet on a regular basis, either with the elected lawmakers, representatives, or regulators and bureaucrats in the agencies that are supposed to regulate those very businesses. In fact, one of the things I discovered writing the book, Save the Swamp, there's just this basic revolving door of bureaucrats who go from working in big corporations to working in the regulatory agencies that are supposed to be regulating those big corporations, and then back.
Right.
They all know each other. And so when I don't know, the agency that approves medicines, the FDA, when the FDA sits down to make a regulation about some medicine, guess who's in the room helping them make those regulations?
The lobbyists from the big pharma companies.
From the big pharma.
And let's be clear, for anybody who thinks otherwise, the lobbyists for the big pharma are not advocating for fewer regulations.
That's right.
The lobbyists for the big banks are not lobbying for fewer regulations on the banks. Why? Because if there's more regulations, they know that they're the only ones who can afford the regulations.
That's right.
They can justify to their customer, hey, I'm sorry the costs went up on this. It's the government's fault.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they're keeping all of their competition away.
This is so critical for our members to understand this point. There are millions of progressives in the United States, millions of people. They call themselves liberals or progressives, or sometimes they call themselves democratic socialists. And they will say, these darn big corporations, right? They're evil, they're terrible. We really need to rein them in. Okay. Grant the premise to them. Say, yeah, you're right. Many of those big corporations are full of corruption and cronyism.
Yep.
Guess what happens as you pass more regulations? You're helping the very big corporations you think are evil, and you are crushing the smaller businesses that are trying to compete against those big corporations.
Which makes those big businesses so much more necessary or critical to our infrastructure, to our business world, right? The world can't exist without banks. I mean, we still have to have banks to keep our money safe. We have to have a way to exchange capital, to do different things. I mean, the entire economy is based on a banking industry, right? So if you have that and you've gotten rid of every community bank,
right, that's left.
When the banks are in trouble, you have no choice but to bail them out.
That's right.
When the housing bubble crashed in 2007, they had no choice because you can't have no banks.
Right. And because of regulations, we're left with, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, a couple of the big national banks. In fact, in the realm of banking, here's a couple of examples from two of the most heavily regulated industries. And again, this is worth repeating. Progressives say we need to regulate the big corporations because they're evil, they're bad, they're trying to hurt people. Well, two of the most heavily regulated industries are banking and health insurance companies. All of Obamacare is regulating and controlling health insurance companies. And in both situations, we're down now to 5 or 6 big national institutions in the banking world and in the health insurance world. There's only a few left because it is so expensive. It is so difficult. The regulatory obstacles, the compliance requirements are so over the top. Go try to start a health insurance agency today. You would have to have enormous amounts of capital, and it would take years.
Right.
It would probably take a decade or more before you could actually open your business and start selling health insurance.
People should keep this in mind as we've been talking about social media, right? That's been a big topic in the news lately. Should we start regulating social media industry businesses? Let's keep this in mind when you talk about should we regulate Facebook and Twitter and Google and YouTube. And I don't approve of a lot of the decisions they're making. But there's a reason that Mark Zuckerberg keeps going in front of Congress and saying, please regulate us. Please, I want you to regulate us.
They have the teams of bureaucrats and lawyers and experts who can navigate all those regulations. Whereas if you're starting a new internet platform, social media platforms, right? We've started a new kind of platform through the Vino Veritas Society. We don't have teams of lawyers and bureaucrats and everybody else like Facebook does. And that's exactly right. The big businesses that get regulated benefit the most from those regulations. And it's the small competitors who end up getting crushed by them.
Another regulation that we've talked, that we haven't talked about yet, but that I mentioned a few minutes ago, that's unions. I remember when I was in college, I got a part-time job. It was 2 weeks every year, and they forced me to join a union. They said, you can't come to work without joining this union.
For 2 weeks?
For 2 weeks.
Yeah.
2 weeks a year, I had to join a union, which means I had to pay my union dues, and I had to keep my union membership active. And it was the United Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. And a lot of people I really respect. I think the trades are incredibly important.
Right.
And I think there's some electricians who are a lot better than others.
By the way, it sounds a little sexist. There probably should have been sisters in there too.
Well, yeah.
This was pre-modern,
apparently,
the radical era of progressivism.
Apparently. Yeah. So this job was kind of a fun job for a college kid. This job was, I worked at the International Golf Tournament down at Castle Pines every year. I had to join the electrical union to hold a tripod for a cameraman on the back of a golf cart. I had to join a union for this. I'm a college kid. I'm 20 years old. I'm 21. And I'm on the back of a golf cart. And literally, this was my whole job the whole time, the whole event. I'd sit on the back of a golf cart. They'd pull up to a spot. The cameraman would point. I would set up the tripod, and I would sit in the grass for 35 minutes while he sat there with his camera there shooting all the golfers coming through that hole.
Yeah.
I made $35 an hour 25 years ago doing this job.
That's impressive. Yeah.
Because it was a union job.
Yeah. Now, do you recall, were union dues taken out of your paycheck? In other words, was it already deducted before you received your check?
No, because I had to pay them in advance to renew my union.
Gotcha.
But I had to make sure my union dues were active before the tournament
before you
started.
Could even work.
Before I could have the job.
Had to have your union card.
Meals were paid for. We were working 90-hour weeks, so 50 hours a week of that $35 an hour was overtime at time and a half. I mean, absurd. You could have paid me at that point. You could have paid me $5 an hour to sit and get to watch a professional golf tournament. But here's the trick about that: that golf tournament's gone. Why? It no longer made sense. They don't make money on ticket sales. They don't make money on enough money on the sponsorships. They make money on the television. And CBS, who was the provider at the time, decided this tournament isn't profitable enough for us. Why? Because they had to pay people like me $35 an hour plus overtime.
Right. So those regulations, like union requirements, what that's doing is, to our point again, increases the cost of everything, including putting on a golf tournament. Right, made it more expensive,
which makes the business disappear.
Yeah.
It was a great tournament.
Yeah.
People who lived here, we loved going out and watching it. It was a fun time. I value great golfers playing and being able to do all of that, and you're sitting there forcing me to lose out on that. Because
look at the whole picture that we're painting here. So on the one hand, you have on the business side, you have big businesses clamoring for more regulations because very often it helps them secure a kind of monopoly or a sort of a limited monopoly. It helps to drive away smaller competitors. So you have big corporations begging for more regulations. Right. And to everyone listening, right, to your progressive friends that you have, that should cause a light bulb to go off in their head. If they come to learn that big corporations lobby for more regulations, I would think any progressive would want to know, well, why? Why is that? Because it helps the big corporation. Then you have the government side of it, the regulators, the bureaucrats. They want to create more regulations because what that means for them is more power. Right. More authority. It can also be used to justify a bigger budget for their regulatory agencies. Say, look, we've been creating all these regulations. We're now controlling all these businesses and industries. We need more staff, more resources. We need more money to be allocated from Congress to our regulatory agency.
There's one more important thing on that you left off. Job security.
That's right.
Yes. The more regulations on an industry, the more important as a bureaucrat your job becomes, because you are that regulator. There has to be somebody there, and as long as you're showing up to work every day, it doesn't matter if you're doing a great job.
Yeah.
As your book clearly demonstrates. But as long as you show up every day, you're going to keep your job.
You're going to keep it. It is almost impossible to fire, certainly at the federal government, and I think this is largely true in state and county and local governments too. It is nearly impossible. It's very difficult to fire an unelected bureaucrat for the federal government. And even when they do get fired, in those rare moments, very often they just end up getting hired by some other they're still a government bureaucrat. They just went from one agency to the next. So these things, these problems just sprawl and creep. For the regulators, the bureaucrats in government, one of the problems is they create so many regulations that often, or there'll either be a formal regulation or there'll be an informal command from a regulator. And they'll contradict each other. I tell a story in the book of a facility, I think it was a hospital, and one of the regulators comes by and says the floor area where they were doing food preparation must be dry 24 hours a day, or we will pull your license. You can't operate. The next regulator comes along and says this floor must be wet mopped twice a day. There you have, right, two regulations, two commands from regulators that directly contradict each other. You can't keep it dry and wet mop it at the same time. And so imagine what that does. You're the business owner. What exactly are you going to do in that situation? I knew a couple out in California, humble couple. One was a teacher. The other one might have been a firefighter or a police officer or something like that. These were people they were not wealthy people, but they saved up their entire lives, and their retirement dream was to build a little house overlooking the ocean. They had lived in Southern California their whole lives. They'd never lived by the ocean, and that's a big deal in California. So they saved and saved, and they were in their 70s. They bought a little piece of land in Malibu overlooking the ocean, had some architects draw up the plans to build a small little house, and they start construction. And the California Coastal Commission comes along and says, you did not do an environmental impact on certain animals out here in the ocean. You must stop construction. They had started like bulldozing the top of the hill. You must stop construction. A couple of days later, a bureaucrat from Los Angeles County came along and said, you started bulldozing this hill. you must finish the project because you've created a landslide danger. One said, we're going to fine you $25,000 a day if you continue working. The other said, we're going to fine you $25,000 if you don't. And there they were. In the end result, it destroyed their lives. They went bankrupt. No house was ever built. Terrible things happened. That's what happens when these regulators get all this regulatory control. They can make your life a living hell.
Yes.
If you're a business owner and you somehow, run afoul of a certain regulator who has it out for you.
I think the summary is pretty clear, right? These regulations, if you're a small business, if you're trying to create a great product for the right value for your customer, the more regulations, the more government intrusion, the more government involvement, the lower the quality of the product is going to be, the higher the cost of the product is going to be, and eventually you're not going to be able to create it at all.
And let's make clear why the quality is lower. Because when you have all these regulations, all of a sudden the business has to produce things not the best way possible, but according to the regulation. They have to be in compliance, which ends up stifling creativity. A business might say, I've got a better way to do this. And here's the other one of the unforeseen consequences. This is a concept free market economists love to emphasize, that every action, every policy, every regulation has all kinds of unintended consequences. Sure. Here's one of them. When you create these mountains of regulations, not only we talked in one way how it helps big corporations, it helps them in another way. It shields them from responsibility. So when British Petroleum blew up an oil well out in the Gulf of Mexico, and it was spewing enormous amounts of oil right into the water, you know what their very first response was? We were in compliance. Don't look at, right? In other words, they were saying, as a business, hey, don't pin the blame on us. The regulators told us how every aspect of our operation, and we did what they told us. Go blame them. They're to blame. And there's some truth to that, right?
What all of a sudden starts happening is the business starts worrying about being in compliance rather than being profitable.
That's right.
And like we talked about at the very beginning of this, being profitable is the bigger priority than being in compliance. If you're not profitable, you're not paying your employees, you're not investing in new products, you're not investing in creating better value for your customers.
You're investing in compliance officers.
Right, which doesn't create any value, doesn't provide any wealth, and ends up in the long run hurting your product.
Right.
It hurts the quality of your product in the long run. I have a friend, they owned Caribou Ranch Recording Studio up outside of Boulder, Colorado. And the guy who started it, his name is Jim Guercio. Jim had been running studios in California, in Beverly Hills and in Southern California for years.
He had a background in music, right?
Yeah, he was a bass player. He played backup bass for the band Chicago. He became their tour manager. He eventually became the tour manager for the Beach Boys. Yeah. And he was running these recording studios in LA. And there were so many regulations. He had to have union workers, and he had to be open at certain times and couldn't be open past certain times. And they had to have a maximum amount of all these different things. And the electrical going to the system had to be in a certain way. And all of these regulations, that it became extremely expensive to record. And these bands were coming in, and it was a rush. You'd get them into the office, you'd get them into the studio, and okay, guys, you're on the clock. We're billing you at hundreds of dollars an hour for these great bands. And art takes time, doesn't it? I mean, if these guys are going to really do their best work, it takes time to really, hey, I want to hear that again. I didn't like that. I think a lot of people have recently seen that the movie came out a year or two ago, Bohemian Rhapsody.
Yeah.
And when they actually recorded that song, I remember the scene where they're recording that song, and he keeps saying, do it again higher, do it again higher. But they kept re-listening to the song and doing it over and over and over again. It got to a point, though, that was years ago. It got to a point that it became too expensive because of regulations, because of costs of union workers and everything else. It became too expensive to actually produce, to hear it over and over and over and keep recording. So he says, I'm moving out to the middle of nowhere. And he goes and he opens this ranch in the middle of nowhere, outside of a lot of these regulations, builds this huge huge.
And this is Caribou Ranch.
This is Caribou Ranch.
Outside of Boulder.
Outside of Boulder.
But
It was about.
Important, not in Boulder.
Correct.
Outside of Boulder.
Outside of Boulder in a little town called Nederland.
Yeah.
And he actually had to go outside of Nederland, in fact, to actually do this. He walked into the county clerk's office or whatever, land management, whatever it is, and says, draw me a circle of where my regulations, where I have to use union workers, where the regulations apply, all of that. Mm-hmm. They drew him this big circle around the city, and he points to an area right outside and says, I want that land.
Exactly.
But the point was, he didn't have any of this regulation. He didn't have any of the union requirements or anything else. And what he did was he said, come stay with me. If you're an artist, he built these big cabins.
So let me guess. He produced terrible music by terrible bands, right? Because he didn't have any regulations.
26 Grammy-winning albums in 8 years. 26, and some of the most famous albums you've ever listened to. Elton John, Michael Jackson, John Lennon showed up one day. Elton John, tell me you could do this in an LA studio. Elton John was trying to do a cover of the song Imagine.
Yep.
And he kept listening to it, and I don't like it. I don't like it. He recorded this over and over and over again for 3 days. He would never do that in LA. You record it once, it's done, it's on the album. Finally, after 3 days, he calls John Lennon. He says, there's a ticket waiting for you in London. You're flying to Denver, Colorado. There'll be a Cadillac waiting to pick you up and drive you 2 hours to this ranch in the middle of nowhere. And they're sitting in the studio collaborating on how do I make this song better. Right. Why? Because government wasn't in the way. Exactly and he could do it.
And we should address here one of the first concerns that is always raised whenever you point out the problems of regulations. Progressives will say, but we need these regulations because people will produce poison and label it as medicine, right? They'll produce dangerous, hurtful things because they all want to kill us. And in response to that, we should point out that the greatest regulatory kind of pressure is a free market.
Consumer demand,
consumer scrutiny. You want to try producing poison and labeling as medicine and sell that to people, see what happens, right? You will be crushed. You will be destroyed. Not only will no one ever buy anything from you again, you will get sued for everything that you have and you'll lose, it'll ruin your life. So that is the best. In fact, the pressures, the demands of a market of consumers is far greater than anything that any of the regulators can ever come up with. So if you're worried about quality, if you want better quality at lower prices, the best thing in the world is not more regulations. It's more freedom, more free market, more free demand and scrutiny by consumers.
Think about what that restaurant is going to do if they start serving food that's getting people sick.
That's right.
It's going to close.
That's right.
Almost immediately.
That's right.
And nobody's going to go because people are going to tell their friends.
Yep, that's absolutely right. Well, I think we've covered here a lot of important basic topics about wealth creation, what a business is, all the problems created when government decides to get busy regulating and controlling businesses. I want to make the point clear before we close out. Some people might wonder, are these guys saying there should be no regulations? I'll go so far and say there should be no regulations. There's an old form of law called tort law, that Latin root of tort. It's the same root we get the word torture. It means to damage, to hurt. And that's what tort law is. When you do something that hurts someone, damages something, they can sue you. You're liable for that. You have to make them whole. That is a beautiful aspect of a free society. It means people should be free to do with their property, their business, whatever they want to do. No regulations, and if they do something hurtful, they're accountable. Regulations are the opposite. Regulations come and say, we're going to tell you what to do and not do before you've done anything. Before you've even opened your doors for business, we're going to come and tell you, because regulations assume people are guilty before they've done anything, which is why we should have no regulations at all.
And to add to that, to anybody who's sitting there thinking, well, how could you have no regulations? Think back to what the incentives are for everybody involved. Just
That's right.
That is the basics of it, right? What is the incentive for the customer? What is the incentive for the business owner? What is the incentive for the bureaucrat?
Yep.
What is the incentive for the elected official? And when you think about all four of those people and what their incentives are, really think about who do you want making the decision of how a product is being produced, sold, manufactured, distributed anything else.
And I want to add, for most people, I think it's easy to understand that that business owner, that consumer, they have their personal interests and they pursue their personal interests. But for some reason, when their mind shifts over to the bureaucrat or the elected lawmaker, they think, well, those people in government just want to help mankind.
Right.
Just want to help people. No, they're human beings.
They're still human beings.
They have personal
Yes.
interests. They want power. They want privilege. They want resources. They want to get as much as they can. And what we've done is we've created a very kind of perverse incentive system for them to get rewards and promotions, basically by violating people's rights rather than protecting them. And
Right.
that's our job at the Vino Veritas Societies, to help remind Americans of the American idea of a government that protects their rights, and that idea is sorely in need of guardians, which is what we do.
We are the guardians. No sumus
No
custodes.
sumus custodes.